Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast, Episode 64.
Welcome to the Out of Order Podcast, your window into the firearms community, exploring those shaping the future of our rights and protecting our lifestyle, laws, legal cases, activism, and self-defense in a candid and honest podcast for our brothers and sisters in arms. Here's your host, James Kalita.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 64 of the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. Today's sponsor is the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. So please head over to the show notes page, outoforderjameskalita.com/64, the show notes page for today, and you'll have an opportunity to become a Patreon supporter of the show when you'll get exclusive access to our members-only Facebook group and personalized thank you message on the show. Today's guest is Brad Wilson. Brad Wilson is a professional poker player, author, podcaster. He's also anti-gun, first anti-gun guest I've had on this show, and we talk about his philosophy, and I question how his very proactive philosophy is consistent with his anti-gun views. And now, here's Brad.
Brad Wilson, welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir. How's it going?
Oh, very good, very good. So, Brad, you are the host of the Process Podcast and founder of MentallyInvincible.com, and a rarity on this show, you also happen to be in favor of gun reform. So would you like to tell us a little about that?
Yeah, so my podcast, The Process, it's given me the opportunity to think in depth about the processes that really control the decision-making process, just the process of everything, whether it be gun control, gun reform laws, whether it be getting medical devices approved and released to the public. I look at everything now as a process. One of my guests said something to me that really resonated with me, and now I look at things from a process perspective, and he said that a bad process beats a good person every single time. And so now, I try to see both sides of the picture, and really if you want change in the world, you have to look at things, the root cause of why these things are happening in the first place, and then attack things from that perspective. So, the gun reform is me looking at the issues that we deal with in the United States, and then seeing how do we fix these moving forward? How do we do a better job? I have two little girls, so the gun violence, especially in Florida, it affects me. I want my kids to live in a safe society and not be afraid of something like that happening to them.
So it seems like as I'm going through your website and listening to some of the episodes on your podcast, I listened to the one with the Olympic guy and I forget the one I just listened to already. But that individual responsibility and taking responsibility for your own life and shaping your own life is important to you. And that's something that resonates with a lot of gun owners. And, when we hear that, one of the things we think about is that our safety is our own individual responsibility. And that's why we gravitate towards owning firearms and carrying them for self-defense. But am I not reading your...
No, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
Oh.
And so this is a difference between, I've researched, like I said, I want people to live a life that's true to themselves, which means questioning any assumptions they've made as they have their own life experience. And so I've done a lot of research on, gun violence, gun laws in different countries, because I think we can both agree that nobody humans are all born with the relatively same potential, right? We're not, in Iceland, there hasn't been a gun homicide since 2007, right? So are people in Iceland born less prone to commit gun homicides than in the United States? I don't think so. I think that the reason why these things are so prevalent here versus there is the process. And so I've researched the process of these different countries and, what it seems to be that they're getting right. And you touched on something that is one of the major differences in, say, in Iceland versus the U.S. In Iceland, they have around 30 guns per 100 people. In the U.S., we have 110, but basically they have, a fair amount of guns per 100 people to not have a homicide for the last 11 years. So they look at guns as primarily used as hunting and sport, and we look at guns as being used for protection, right? So that right there is a difference of beliefs. And, I don't know why exactly the protection thing happens, because I think about it rationally, that we have a right to protect ourselves. And obviously we do, right? If there's a home invader, having a gun is a form of protection. But I think about it from a situation, if somebody breaks into my home, number one, am I even going to be able to access the gun to protect myself in the first place? What are your thoughts on that?
As firearms owners, we go through a lot of training, and the further into the training you get, the more you get into, I shouldn't say the further, it kind of starts with situational awareness and preparedness and having a security plan for your home so that you are aware of potential threats earlier and
Sure.
you have access to your firearm faster, and that you train your family on what to do in that case to create the most efficient and safest way to defend your life, your liberty, your family. I think if you invest a little time in it, that it's very easy to defend against not easy, but it's possible, and to prepare against a home invader, and certainly better than the alternative, simply saying that because I may not be able to get to my firearm fast enough, that I'm not going to have any means of defending myself. But you mentioned two things that I want to touch on before we get too much further. You mentioned that in Iceland they haven't had a gun homicide in 7 years. And 11 years, 2007, right? But they have had homicides. And so that's something that always triggers an alarm bell with gun rights activists, is that, if you segment gun violence, what that signals to us is that what you really want to do something about is guns, not the violence. Because I'm sure Iceland has had homicides in the past 11 years. And by eliminating the guns and eliminating the ability of people to defend themselves there, they did not eliminate the homicides. The homicides are still there, just the guns aren't there. And it's a common theme when I look at, varying degrees of gun regulation throughout Europe. The common denominator is you don't have the right to self-defense, and you definitely don't have the right to carry a gun for self-defense. And even in countries like Ireland, where the presumption of self-defense is still there somewhat, definitely not with a gun. So even if you have a firearm permit, you're not supposed to use it defensively. And so when we hear gun control advocates talking about that, we see that's where it's going, and that's the primary thing for us. Hunting is great, shooting sports are great, but it's primarily our right to defend our life, liberty, and property.
So, as far as the homicides go in Iceland, I'm sure that there are homicides. It is a different culture. It's a different society, right?
Uh-huh.
I think that the easiest way to commit a homicide is with a firearm. And that's, point number one. You can have knife violence. You can have different forms of violence, but the easiest mechanism to commit a homicide is through gun ownership, right? And, like I said, I'm not anti-gun, firstly. I don't think, you can look at a society like Japan and say, well, there's almost no gun violence in Japan, and that's because nobody has a gun, right? All the regulations, all the restrictions basically make it to where owning a gun is really tough. The problem that I have in the United States when it comes to the process of owning a gun is that in 30 states, if I want a gun, I can be sold a gun directly from family, friends, somebody that I know, right, with no background check, no mental health check, no anything like that, which that seems like not such a good thing. And I'm not sure why it's so important for the secondary market to thrive and be so robust. But I know that a lot of money is spent in keeping that secondary market going through lobbyists and the NRA and stuff like that. So I guess, firstly, why is it such a priority to, keep that secondary gun market going? And why should I or why should you be able to sell a firearm to somebody that but without giving them, a criminal background check, a mental health check, or anything like that?
Yeah, it's kind of that erosion of freedom. When this law was passed, when the Brady Bill was passed, it brought up that it reverses the burden of proof. That all of a sudden, it's no longer the government's responsibility to prove that you're a criminal, right? You have to prove that you're innocent and that that the government no longer has to prove that you don't have this right. You have to prove that you do have this right. And so, as a counter to that, when they were talking about passing this law, they said, look, it's okay because even though you'll need a background check to buy a new gun, you'd still be able to buy a gun, in the secondary market. So there's still a check there that if the government went, berserk, that you'd still be able to acquire a firearm. The same thing was said when they made the law for people under the age of 21, between 18 and 21, to buy a handgun. They said it didn't infringe on your Second Amendment rights because you'd still be able to buy a long gun. But fast forward a couple decades, and now they're saying, well, why is it okay? Why can't, we're stopping these kids from buying a revolver, but we're letting them buy an AR-15. We need to raise the age of buying rifles to 21. So those of us that have lived long enough, and I know anti-gunners hate when we say the slippery slope, but those of us who've lived long enough have kind of slid down that slope already, and we're seeing it go even further. And the other part of the background check problem is that, the Second Amendment, it was written there, and the idea was if the government became so tyrannical, the people would be able to take up arms and defend against their tyrannical government. Now, there's questions about how practical that is, and we can talk about them or not, but that's what that's there for. And if you give the power to the government to decide whether or not an individual can have guns, you take away the ability of the individual to defend against the tyrannical government. And I interviewed an author recently. He wrote a book about gun control in Nazi-occupied France, and it was exactly that. It was a large gun culture, and shortly before the Nazi occupation, they began a registration, and as soon as the Nazis assumed power, they began confiscation and threatening death for people who did not, within 24 hours, turn in their firearms. And, despite firearms being airdropped from the Allies and people burying their firearms in the fields, even at the very end of the resistance, there was still a huge shortage of firearms for the French to defend themselves. So it's the reversal of the burden of proof. It's the putting the fox in charge of the hen house. It's all of those things. Really, we need to repeal the Brady Act. Right? And it's been illegal for a felon to own a firearm, but I think the burden of proof needs to remain with the state to prove that case, and not have it be the burden of the individual to prove that they have the right to own a firearm.
So there are a couple things that I want to go back to
Okay.
About what you just said. And number one is the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. And this is a sticky point. And, when you think about the right to bear arms, I think that this could, it's a very intangible concept that can mean different things to different people. And I went back and I wanted to know, what was life like when the Second Amendment was, added to the Constitution? And number one, life at, I believe it was 1792, maybe 1797, but 1792, I think, when the Second Amendment went through. Basically, there was no police force. There was no sitting army. So as far as justice and protecting yourself, it was, important that we had rights to own a gun. We were worried about Indian raids. And also we needed guns to, as sad as it sounds, squash slave rebellion in the case that slaves rebelled, because, slavery was still a thing back when the Second Amendment went through. And, these things don't apply today. And we could have a debate as to whether, if the government wanted to crush us, I don't, things have changed in the last few hundred years where I don't think a handgun is going to do much good. I don't think that a militia of, say, 1 million people rising up against the government, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars in military and technology. I mean, that doesn't seem very practical to me, first of all. I don't think that, there was a time a few hundred years ago when, it was a different world that could have been the case. But I don't think it applies today. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's always going to be the threat to your life, your liberty, and your property. And so you have to have some means of defense there. The standing army, we didn't have a standing army, and that was a huge issue for the founding fathers, that, we could, we absolutely, no matter what, we should never have a standing army. So if we were going to make a change, my preference would be that we get rid of the standing army and keep the militia. As far as
how is that practical, though, in today's day and age? How could we get rid of our standing army that, we're worried about, our property, our life, and our liberty, when there are threats out there that, places that do have standing armies that could threaten us at any time, especially given modern technology, that we need to be cognizant and aware of, and be on constant defense with.
Right, and I believe strongly in free markets, and that this could take us off into whole other hours of conversation, but that we could replace the standing army with private security forces, and and everyone, I think people tend to get a little scared when you say that, because what would stop the private security force from just assuming too much power? But the big difference is you could hire a security company today, fire them tomorrow if you didn't like the way they were performing. But regardless of how you feel about every military expenditure and every military activity, invasion, war, any type of combat, whatever name they want to give it, you're forced to pay for it. And so, we can sit here and, talk on TV and on the radio about which foreign policy is the right foreign policy, but if you have a choice of which ones you pay for, you are individually responsible for the outcomes and the amount of safety and security that you want to invest in. So, not everybody would have a tank, but a group of people could get together and fund a group of tanks or a group of airplanes, and I think it would be certainly be a much more efficient. And as far as you look at we spend as much as the next 10 militaries combined. So I don't think there's anybody out there, even if we reduced our expenditures by 90%, we could still be ahead of the rest of the world as far as our defense abilities.
Well, I think we could reduce the expenditures without moving to private protection. And again, look at the process of the military creating things, how much money it takes, why it takes so much money, what's the approval process. That's something that I think needs to be analyzed in order to reduce our expenses, because I think it is a little absurd just how much money we spend on the military when, like in a free market type system, those expenses would likely go down because it's a private company, and private companies are going to think about the expenses. When it's the government, they don't really think about the expenses because, they have money machines and they have taxes and they generate a lot of money, and for whatever reason, it's not such a big deal spending 10x or 100x than they otherwise should. But And another thing that, I want to go back to, sorry.
That's okay.
It's a non-linear conversation. But, you mentioned Nazi Germany. And I think, Nazi Germany, that was a fascist regime, right?
Yeah.
Our government is not a fascist regime. And I'm just curious as to think, why by eliminating guns or reducing guns, and there's a lot of case studies around the world. There's Australia, there is Japan, for instance, where they have, and the UK banned handguns. They have reduced guns, and it isn't they didn't become a fascist regime. So, I don't see why this is such a prevalent fear when it comes to gun reform.
I mean, we're not in a fascist regime today, but I listened to, the anti-Obama crowd for 8 years talk about how Obama was just like Hitler. And I'm listening now to the Antifa crowd talk about how Trump is just like Hitler. And, going back to what you said about the amount of military and technology that we have, it could happen, right? Nothing's really in place that would stop it from going that way. And that's what the founders, from what they wrote, what we saw, they believed that nothing was more than a generation away from being, becoming a.
We have a system of checks and balances. I mean, our government is set up in a way that no one entity has absolute power. And I think we should all be thankful for that, right? So in order to change to a fascist regime, there would have to be a revolution and an overthrow of the complete system of democracy that we have in the United States.
Well, not really. Because, what gun owners see a lot, and I think even if you're on the other side of the political spectrum, it's things get ignored, right? And then they proceed anyway. Like, we go all the way back to the Trail of Tears, right? Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal for us to move those people. And President Jackson came out and said, well, he has his ruling. Now let's see him enforce it. And he sent them anyway, right? And there's some question about whether Washington overstepped his bounds with the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania, whether the president overstepped his bounds with the Barbary Pirates. So, we have checks and balances. People ignore them, or presidents and other politicians ignore them all the time, right? And, it's not gotten to the point where we've seen a complete erosion of our freedoms. There's been a huge erosion of our freedoms since the beginning of the country, but it can either happen gradually, as it has been, or it could happen suddenly by someone ignoring those checks and balances. And we looked at, as gun owners, we look at the Heller decision as being a huge victory, and but that was more than 40 years where no one in Washington D.C. was able to exercise their right to keep and bear arms, let alone carry one for self-defense. And so more than a lifetime for some people went by, and it cost more than $1 million to defend that case. And when they won, it's still been 10 years, and they're still working through the process, and they're still trying to get Washington, D.C. to comply with the Supreme Court ruling. So we have these checks and balances, but evil still happens. And going back to what you said, too, about, Europe, parts of Europe, being, enacting gun control and not turning into a fascist regime, there are many cases. There's actually a chart out there by Jews for the Preservation of Firearm Ownership that lists instances where there was gun registration, where it led to confiscation, and then led to genocide. And off the top of my head, it's about 16 instances long in the past 200 years. And it's great that England hasn't gotten there yet. It's great that other countries haven't gotten there yet. But we still see that it has happened before. And we look at, when you enact gun control, what you definitely do is take guns away from law-abiding citizens, and you limit people's right to defend their life, liberty, and property. But you don't take away the violence, and you don't necessarily take away the guns. And we saw that in France a few years ago, where terrorists came in with guns that were banned in that country and used them to commit mass murder. So even with strict gun control like France, you still didn't eliminate the gun violence, but you did eliminate the right to defense of life, liberty, and property.
Well, there's going to be outliers, right?
Sure.
The point is you minimize it as much as possible. And like I said, it's an apple and orange type comparison to me. When, if we think that the government is on the verge of being tyrannical, is on the verge of fascism, then why are we spending so much energy thinking about guns when we should be looking at the processes of the government and how we can stop that from happening? Because I don't think individuals owning handguns is necessarily going to make a giant difference if there is some sort of revolution and we do move to a more fascist regime.
Well, so you brought up, you feel it's unlikely that we would be able to defend against a tyrannical government, people with handguns. But if we look back on history, we had our own issues trying to wage a war in a country that basically just had rifles. Russia had a hard time in Afghanistan. The American Revolution is a huge example of, we had the most powerful army in the world, and we resisted. Or British had the most powerful army in the world, and we resisted in spite of that.
Right, sorry. Go ahead.
So history is filled with examples of, the underdog winning, or the person without the most powerful arms and the best army winning. And then it also kind of goes back to that point where, it's better to have a means of defense than say, well, I would never win, so I'm not even going to try. And so I'll invite you to apply those thoughts to, the other areas of your life where, if you had someone who said, look, I want to start, I want to do this in my life, but I'm never going to succeed, so why bother? I don't think you would accept that answer from them. Like if they said, I want to be, a professional skier, or I want to be a stock trader, but I'm never going to succeed, so I'm not going to try. I don't think you'd let them get away with that. So in the same way, defensively, just because, my small arsenal of a rifle, shotgun, and handgun isn't enough to, resist an army, doesn't mean necessarily that I should give up my rights, my freedom, and give up those 3 guns, because maybe somewhere in the interim there is a threat that I can defend myself against.
Well, somebody pursuing their dreams is a lot different than defending yourself with a gun. It's a lot different.
Because what are your dreams without your life?
Because, it's just, I don't really get the comparison. To go back to us and the Revolutionary War, there's a lot of factors that went into us being able to win our independence from England. For instance, they were in wars on multiple fronts. They had a lot of things going on at the time that allowed us to win our independence. And was Afghanistan successful against Russia because of the rifles, because of the guns, or was it because of the terrain? Was it because of some more strategic factors? So I don't think, those examples that you gave are necessarily great indicators of one's success. Success with the gun or rifle when facing a government. But
so you're saying that in the case of the American Revolution and in Afghanistan, if they were completely disarmed, they still would have prevailed?
No, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
But I'm saying that them having guns are not the only factor.
Right.
There are multiple contributing factors, right?
Agreed.
If they had wooden swords, they're probably not going to be very successful, right?
Right.
and going back to the Revolutionary War, I mean, muskets weren't even a super efficient way of doing battle. You got about 3 shots a minute. They were basically, a lot of people describe them as good handles for bayonets, right?
Yep.
But
they had cannons, howitzers, and motors too.
So my big thing is, we have the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And first of all, it's life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Guns can defend our lives, and they can take lives. There are murders. There are homicides that are committed by guns. My whole thing is, how do we reduce the number of homicides per year? I feel like it's something that everybody should be able to get behind, reducing the number of gun-related homicide deaths per year.
I was with you until you said gun-related, because it goes back to my whole thing. If you have a 2-ingredient recipe, right, guns and violence, you take away the guns, you're left with the violence. So
we're talking
why
about
not?
guns, though.
Right. Well, why not take away the violence?
If it was a sword podcast, we would talk about removing the swords, right? I mean, I'm specifically talking about guns because it is a gun podcast.
I think if the focus, just because we have a gun control community, right, it kind of takes away from the credibility when they say they want to reduce violence. I think if you want to reduce violence, then you talk about ways of reducing violence. And the fact is, I hate when people say the fact is, and I just said the fact is, but we already have the answer, right? John Lott did a study. It was 20 years, involved every county in the country. And as the number of concealed carry permits went up, violent crime went down. And we have the CLEC study, along with the study that we just found out the CDC refused to release the findings from because it didn't meet the narrative, that about 2.8 million times a year, people defend themselves from violence with firearms. And you contrast that to roughly 9,000 to 11,000 murders a year, or firearm murders a year. It's, we're focusing on, we're going to sacrifice 2.8 million people to save 9,000. That doesn't sound like a logical path to go down. I think what we need to do is look at the causes of violence. And I don't know that we'll ever get to those if everyone keeps focusing on on the gun. Because you had mentioned earlier that the most effective way to kill someone is with a firearm, but really the most effective way to kill someone is with a bomb, right? That's a lot easier, a lot more devastating. And, up until recently, the most lethal school massacre was done with a hatchet. So we got to look at what causes the violence and deal with the violence and not take away the tools people use to defend themselves against violence. I think that's really where, and anytime someone, I can't speak for all gun owners, but just about all the ones I talk to, as soon as someone says gun violence, we're like, whoa, why do you want to get rid of the guns and keep the violence?
I mean, like I said, it's a gun podcast, and this is, I guess, I don't understand why. Like I said, the secondary market is number one. It's not the number one process. 80% of criminals, 80% of felons that get guns buy them from friends and family, right? So why aren't there more checks on the secondary market? I think that's number one. The first process that really needs to be addressed. Secondly, like I mentioned Iceland earlier, one of the things that they do when they buy a gun is they have to go to the police station and explain why they're buying the gun, their intent with purchasing the firearm. These are things, they seem common sense to me. They seem like obvious things that we should do in order to make sure that the guns stay in people who are responsible's hands that have good intentions. Is this?
Well, it's questioned for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that the secondary market, is there as a safety. It was a check and balance put in place against the government having complete control over who has firearms, and it reverses the question. The question really shouldn't be why are guns why are guns allowed to be sold unchecked in the secondary market? The question really is, why did we allow our rights to deteriorate to the point where the government has say over whether or not you have a gun? That was, and that talks about that whole erosion of freedom. That was a piece of freedom that the government was never supposed to be able to take away. I mean, the whole idea of a background check to buy a gun is a violation of the Second Amendment. It proves that the Constitution is not infallible in its ability to protect us. So, I mean, yeah, no, we can't do background checks on the secondary market because we need to stop doing background checks on the primary market, especially when they make 425,000 mistakes a year. That's 425,000 people who try to buy a gun, who should be able to buy a gun, and who can't buy a gun. And so I mean, that's a right denied. Even if they have the $3,000, $5,000, $10,000 a year, or for a lawyer, that's still a right denied. That's still $10,000 that they have to spend to go and buy their $300 Mossberg shotgun.
So somebody with severe mental health problems has the right to go unimpeded to Walmart and buy a gun with no background check, no mental health check, period.
We can make a case for whether or not there are limits on someone's ability to own a firearm, but it's just not, the place is not with the federal government to determine who that is. And, without making any changes, right, we've already had laws in place to restrict that, right? And, the burden is high, and it should be high. If you've been involuntarily committed, right, you cannot own a firearm. And that, it's illegal for your friend to sell you a firearm. It's illegal for the gun store to sell you a firearm, right? So what we're talking about now, what there's a push for now, is to really lower that standard, and that's frightening to me because I've read the DSM-4, and now there's a DSM-5. There's over 500 pages of different ways that you can be crazy, and not a single page or paragraph in that entire book about what it means to be sane or not crazy or mentally healthy. And when you look at the anti-gun theme running through the medical community, I don't trust them to decide who can and who can't have a gun. And when I look at the way states like New Jersey and New York have applied this, where if you've taken Zoloft to help you quit smoking, they won't let you buy a gun. If you took Prozac as a teenager, they won't let you buy a gun. And if you've ever seen a doctor, right, and this means even if you go to the doctor because you have the flu and the doctor notes on your account that, it seemed like you were depressed, right? When this makes it into the National Instant Criminal Background Check, people have been denied the right to own firearms. We have veterans coming back that are diagnosed with PTSD, right? And then they're later told that they're not allowed to have a firearm. So all of this, it's just overwhelming examples of the government overstepping its authority. So, I mean, we can talk about whether or not it's okay for someone who's mentally ill to have a firearm, but the real question is, who is the judge? And the federal government has proven it's not them, and the states have proven it's not them. They are not fit to judge who should and should not have a firearm. They make too many mistakes denying people who should be allowed to have a firearm, and obviously they make too many mistakes stopping people. They're just, if it was any other factor of our lives, if you went to the store and buy milk, and sometimes the milk was bad and it was marked bad, sometimes the milk was good and it was marked bad, sometimes the milk was bad and it was marked good, you wouldn't shop there anymore. You would not give that man any of your money, and you would not let him sell you milk. But when the federal government does the same thing with something significantly more important, we continue to trust them. They're just not, they cannot be trusted to determine who should and who should not have a firearm.
Yeah, the efficiencies of the federal government, I think, are not really something that
you want to defend.
No, not
yeah.
something that I want to defend. I've been to the DMV.
Right.
Yeah. The efficiencies of the federal government, that's not really the point. My point is my point is that there should be a better system in place where people with mental health issues are not getting a gun just because they want it. And number one, even for homicide protection, I think that number two, I had a gentleman on my show. His name's Bruno Gouvernement. It's he's Canadian and French, so it's tough for me to get his last name. But he was in the military in Canada, and he was diagnosed with PTSD. And he when he got sick and he was discharged from the military, he went home and dealt with a lot of mental health issues. He was suicidal, effectively, and he said that basically, if he had a gun in his bedside table, that he would have just ended it. And I asked him, why didn't you have a gun in your bedside table? And he just said that basically he's not a firearm person. He has dealt with firearms a lot, but didn't really feel the need to own one in his house. And then I asked him, because this is something that I think a lot about, if you would have had a gun in your bedside table, would you be sitting here talking to me today? And he said 98% he wouldn't, because it's an easy way out. If you're triggered, if your emotions are high. I have a friend that I was growing up with. His dad got into a fight because he was getting divorced with his mom. He went inside, got a gun, shot himself, right? This is a mental health issue. And if people with mental health problems are allowed to have guns, I do believe that it contributes significantly to the suicide rate. Simply because, again, it's very easy to pull the trigger in a situation where you're triggered versus another method of committing suicide. But anyway, this may be a different argument for a different day. But basically what I'm saying, my whole point is in my opinion, there need to be bigger checks. There need to be bigger restrictions. There needs to be a better process. And if the people who have a tendency towards violence, if they're prevented from buying a gun, then that makes it less of a need for us to feel like we need to protect ourselves. So I think that's a win too. But I guess those are my final thoughts. Anything you want to say? I guess.
Well, you mentioned the restrictions that you want there. You want more, more universal background checks. How do you feel about carrying guns? Suppose someone goes through your background check. Do you feel like they have the right to carry their firearm with them wherever they go for the purpose of defending their life, liberty, and property?
Can you ask that question again? Sorry.
Sure. Assuming someone made it through your level of scrutiny, whatever that is, would you agree that people have the right to carry a firearm to defend their life, liberty, and property wherever they go?
Assuming that they go through to carry a firearm.
Yeah, whatever background check you want to put in place, whatever that threshold is.
Sure.
Okay. Great.
And why not? I mean, assuming that, they're mentally healthy, that they're a responsible person, that their intent, that they've discussed their intent with the firearm. If they still feel the need to protect themselves and carry a gun, then go for it. But when I'm allowed to sell a firearm to somebody who's untrained and not responsible, I think that just makes the United States a scarier place.
So really the only thing we're disagreeing on is what kind of checks are in place, who does the checks, and how thorough those checks should be.
Sure. The system, the process for approval to own a firearm. Like I said, if your intent is good, if you're responsible, if you're the type of person to create a system for a home invasion, an efficient way to protect yourself and implement that, then great. More power to you. But most people, I think, are not that responsible, unfortunately.
Even in the career that you have, and you're seeking people out, and if you're going to reach 1 million people, surely the 1 million people that you reach in the next year, they will have achieved the level of self-awareness and self-responsibility to own a firearm?
I'm saying that being in the internet world, knowing how hard it is to get people to take the steps that they know they should, whether they take them or not, I think is difficult. And, my thing is helping people live a life that's true to themselves. And that, that's a whole different ballgame as far as my personal goals. And living a life that's true to yourself is looking at the information, analyzing it, and making a decision based on your personal beliefs. And, your personal beliefs might be completely different from mine. I don't I don't want anybody to believe exactly what I believe because I say to believe it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I say, look at everything from your own lens, your own perspective, your own life experience. And a lot of times we make these faulty assumptions based on things that our parents told us, based on news sources, based on whatever it is, and we never go back and analyze them. So go back and analyze those things and live a life that's true to you. Like, I think it's a worthy and admirable thing. I think that more people would be happier if they did live a life that was more true to themselves. And I don't really see the correlation to that between, gun laws.
All right. Well, I always ask my guests if there are any books they recommend. You're probably not going to recommend a gun book, but anything out there that comes to mind that you think every gun owner should read?
I have no idea as far as gun owners should read. I mean, I think as far as life goes, I think Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, Tuesdays with Morrie, 2 good books about life. And, that's all I got.
All right. And I'm going to put on the show notes page a link to mentallyinvincible.com and the Process Podcast. Anything else I should throw up there?
No, sir. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks again for tuning in to episode 64 of the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. The show notes page for today is outoforderjameskalita.com/64. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.